The world knew James Brown as the man who could make stadiums explode with a single scream, but what they didn't know was this: one night in Georgia, that same controlled energy nearly destroyed everything he had built. The year was 1963, and Brown stood outside a nightclub with 2 loaded shotguns in his hands, his finger trembling on the trigger. 7 people would leave that building bleeding before the sun came up. But here's what made this night different from every other moment of rage in Brown's turbulent life: the target of his fury wasn't some random stranger or business rival. It was a fellow soul singer, a man who had once stood beside him in the King Records studios, sharing dreams of stardom. A man whose voice could rival Brown's own. A man whose name would become synonymous with the darkest chapter in the Godfather of Soul's story. And the trigger for this volcanic eruption? It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about something far more personal, something that had been festering for years, something that would prove that even legends bleed when their pride gets wounded. Before we dive deeper into this untold story of betrayal, violence, and the price of pride, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is the kind of history that doesn't make it into the documentaries, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The story begins not in violence, but in hope. It was 1955, and King Records in Cincinnati was the beating heart of rhythm and blues, a place where raw talent from the South came to be transformed into something the world had never heard before. James Brown arrived at those studios carrying nothing but a Federal Records contract and a hunger that bordered on desperation. He was 22 years old, had spent 3 years in juvenile detention for armed robbery, and knew that music was his only path away from a life that would otherwise lead straight back to prison or an early grave. He sang with the kind of intensity that made grown men uncomfortable, a ferocity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ambition, somewhere primal and untamed. The producers at King Records didn't quite know what to do with him at first, this skinny kid from South Carolina who screamed like he was being torn apart from the inside, but they recognized something essential: James Brown was willing to work harder than anyone else in that building, and in the music business, that kind of relentless drive could be worth more than pure talent. But even in those early encounters, there were signs of the competition that would eventually consume them both. Brown watched the way audiences responded to Tex's humor, the way he could work a crowd without breaking a sweat, and something dark flickered in his eyes. Tex noticed how Brown commanded absolute loyalty from his band members, how he demanded perfection in every note and every step, and felt the first stirrings of resentment. In the world of soul music in the 1950s, there was barely enough room for one king, and both men knew it. The industry was brutally competitive, record deals could evaporate overnight, and today's star could be tomorrow's forgotten name if they didn't fight tooth and nail to stay relevant. So they watched each other, studied each other's moves, borrowed techniques and styles while pretending not to notice what the other was doing. It was the kind of rivalry that could have pushed them both to greatness, if only it had stayed professional. But it didn't. In 1960, Joe Tex walked away from King Records and signed with Anna Records, a smaller label that promised him more creative control and a bigger piece of the profits. It was a bold move, the kind of decision that could make or break a career, and Tex was betting everything on his ability to craft hits without the King Records machine behind him. One of the first songs he recorded for Anna was called "Baby You're Right," a smooth, mid-tempo number that showcased his vocal range and his gift for turning everyday relationship struggles into something universal. The song had a hook that stayed in your head for days, a melody that felt both fresh and familiar, and Tex was convinced it would be his breakthrough hit. He performed it at small venues across the South, testing it on audiences who responded with the kind of enthusiasm that told him he was onto something special. Radio stations started picking it up, DJs were adding it to their rotation, and for a brief moment, Joe Tex allowed himself to believe that he was about to become a star. Then, in 1961, James Brown walked into a King Records studio and recorded his own version of "Baby You're Right." But this wasn't a cover in the traditional sense. According to Tex and his supporters, Brown had taken his song and fundamentally transformed it, changing the arrangement, altering the lyrics, speeding up the tempo, and most importantly, claiming songwriting credit. When the record was released, James Brown's name appeared as the writer, and the publishing royalties that Tex claimed should have gone to him went instead to Brown. The King Records legal team had reportedly found a loophole, some technicality about Tex's departure from the label that allowed them to argue that any song he'd performed while under contract was still fair game. It was legal, technically, but what Tex and those in his circle considered theft in every way that mattered. Tex maintained that he had written those words, crafted that melody, poured his heart into a song that was supposed to launch his career, and now James Brown was taking credit for it and making money from it while Tex got nothing. If the song theft was the match, B. Ford is alleged to have been the gasoline. B had been Joe Tex's wife during his early years on the road, a woman who had stood by him through poverty and obscurity, who had believed in his talent when nobody else did. But the music business is brutal on marriages, and the constant touring and financial stress eventually tore them apart. By 1962, B and Joe were divorced, and she was trying to rebuild her life while staying connected to the music world that had consumed so much of her time and energy. She started showing up at recording sessions, networking with producers and musicians, looking for opportunities to stay involved in the industry even though her marriage to Tex was over. That's reportedly how she met James Brown. The details of how their relationship began are murky, lost in conflicting stories and decades-old grudges. However, it's alleged that Brown and B. Ford became romantically involved sometime in late 1962. Brown was still married to his first wife, Velma Warren, though that marriage was already falling apart under the weight of his infidelity and obsessive focus on his career. B is said to have represented something different to him, a connection to the world of soul music beyond his own band and his own ambitions. She understood the business, understood the pressures and the sacrifices, and perhaps most importantly, she reportedly represented a way to hurt Joe Tex without ever throwing a punch. When Brown and B allegedly recorded a duet together called You've Got the Power in 1963, it wasn't just a musical collaboration. It was a declaration, a message sent directly to Tex that said, I can take your songs, I can take your woman, I can take anything that matters to you and there's nothing you can do about it. Joe Tex is said to have heard about the relationship before the record was even released. The music industry was a small world, especially for black artists working the same circuit and recording at the same studios, and gossip traveled fast. When someone told him that James Brown was sleeping with his ex-wife, Tex reportedly laughed it off at first, said he didn't care what B did now that they were divorced. But the laughter was hollow, and everyone who heard it knew that something had broken inside him. It wasn't about still being in love with B, though maybe some of those feelings remained. It was about humiliation, about Brown finding yet another way to demonstrate his dominance and his ability to take whatever he wanted. The duet is said to have been the final insult, hearing B.A.'s voice intertwined with Brown's on the radio, knowing that every DJ in the South was probably making jokes about it, probably speculating about what was happening behind closed doors. Tex reportedly started drinking more, started missing rehearsals and showing up late to gigs, started making comments in interviews about other artists who didn't respect the code of the road. He never mentioned Brown by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The confrontation that had been building for 3 years finally erupted on a humid night in Macon in Georgia in October 1963. Both Brown and Tex were scheduled to perform at separate venues in the city, part of the endless touring circuit that kept soul musicians on the road for months at a time. Brown's show ended first, and according to witnesses, he was in a foul mood from the start, snapping at his band members and drinking more heavily than usual. Someone mentioned that Joe Tex was performing across town, and Brown's expression darkened. He'd heard that Tex had been making jokes about him during his sets, imitating Brown's stage moves and his famous cape routine, getting laughs at the Godfather of Soul's expense. Whether this was actually true or just rumor amplified by alcohol and paranoia, Brown believed it, and that belief was enough. What happened next depends on whose version of events you believe, because the official story and the whispered truth are very different. The official record says that there was an altercation at a nightclub, that shots were fired, and that 7 people were injured in the chaos. The police report mentions James Brown's name but doesn't list him as a suspect, which is curious given what witnesses later claimed they saw. The whispered truth, the story that musicians who were there that night have told in private for decades, is much darker. According to them, James Brown left his venue with 2 members of his band, both carrying shotguns that Brown had specifically told them to bring. They drove to the club where Tex had just finished performing, and Brown walked in through the back entrance with a gun in each hand, his famous stage control replaced by something wild and unhinged. Joe Tex wasn't in the building when Brown arrived. He'd left 10 minutes earlier, heading back to his hotel to avoid running into Brown, because he'd heard that the Godfather was in town and looking for trouble. But Brown didn't know that, or didn't care. Witnesses say he started shouting Tex's name as soon as he entered, demanding that someone tell him where that coward was hiding. The club owner tried to calm him down, tried to explain that Tex had already left, but Brown wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in making a point, in showing everyone in that building what happened when you disrespected James Brown. The first shot went into the ceiling, a warning that cleared half the room instantly. The second shot followed seconds later, and this one found human targets. 7 people were hit by shotgun pellets that night, none of them seriously wounded but all of them bloodied and traumatized. The club owner took fragments in his shoulder. A bartender caught some in his leg. 5 patrons were hit by ricochet and debris. Then, as quickly as it started, it was over. Brown lowered the weapons, looked around at the destruction he'd caused, and seemed to come back to himself. The rage that had carried him through those doors drained away, replaced by cold calculation. He knew what would happen if the police came, if this incident made it into the papers. His career would be over, his reputation destroyed, everything he'd built turned to ash. So he did what powerful men with money have always done when they need to make a problem disappear: he paid for silence. The club owner received a cash payment that very night, enough to cover his medical bills and then some. Each of the injured patrons got an envelope with money and a clear message: this never happened, you never saw James Brown here, and if you talk to the police or the press, there will be consequences. And it worked. The incident was reported as a random act of violence, the work of unknown assailants, and James Brown's name stayed out of the headlines. Joe Tex found out about the shooting the next morning, when a friend called his hotel room and told him how close he'd come to being in that club when Brown arrived. The blood drained from his face as he listened to the details, heard about the 7 injured people and the shotgun blasts, and Brown's screamed demands to know where Tex was hiding. He realized in that moment that this wasn't just professional rivalry anymore. This wasn't about stolen songs or romantic betrayals. James Brown had been willing to kill him, had gone to that club with loaded weapons and the intent to use them. If Tex had stayed 10 more minutes after his set, if he'd decided to have one more drink before heading back to his hotel, he might be dead right now. The thought haunted him for years, showed up in nightmares and moments of paranoid certainty that Brown was going to try again. But Tex didn't go to the police, and he didn't go public with accusations. Part of that was fear, the very real knowledge that Brown had connections and resources that Tex couldn't match, that speaking out might result in more violence or a destroyed career. But part of it was also pride, the same pride that had fueled this entire conflict from the beginning. Admitting that he'd been scared, that he'd run away to avoid a confrontation, that Brown had succeeded in intimidating him into silence, all of that felt like defeat. So instead, Tex channeled everything into his music, wrote songs that everyone knew were about Brown even though the name was never mentioned, performed with even more intensity than before because he needed audiences to see that he wasn't broken, wasn't afraid, wasn't going to let James Brown destroy him. His career actually benefited from the renewed focus. He landed a contract with Dial Records in 1964 and started producing the hits that would define his legacy, songs like Hold What You've Got and Skinny Legs and All that showcased his unique blend of humor and soul. For James Brown, the Georgia incident became a ghost that followed him for the rest of his life. He never spoke about it publicly, never acknowledged that it happened, but people who worked with him said they could see the weight of it in unguarded moments. He became even more controlling after that night, more paranoid about betrayal and disrespect, more willing to use fear as a tool to keep his band in line. The famous James Brown discipline, the fines for missed notes and late arrivals, the absolute demand for perfection in every performance, all of it intensified after October 1963. Some musicians who worked with him believed he was trying to maintain control over every aspect of his professional life because he'd lost control so completely that night in Georgia. Others thought he was terrified of his own capacity for violence, scared of what he might do if he let his rage out again. The feud between Brown and Tex never officially ended because it was never officially acknowledged. They existed in parallel universes for the rest of their careers, occasionally crossing paths at award shows or industry events where they would nod coldly at each other and move on. Tex continued to make subtle jabs at Brown in his performances, imitating that famous cape routine with exaggerated movements that made audiences laugh while Brown's fans seethed. Brown responded by dismissing Tex in interviews without naming him, talking about artists who were more concerned with comedy than serious musicianship, making it clear who he meant without giving Tex the satisfaction of direct engagement. It was psychological warfare conducted through music and media, a Cold War that lasted until Tex's death in 1982. Looking back at the Brown and Tex rivalry through the lens of history, what's striking isn't just the violence or the bitterness, but the waste. Both men were genuine talents, artists who contributed significantly to the evolution of soul music and influenced countless musicians who came after them. James Brown revolutionized rhythm, invented funk, became one of the most sampled artists in hip-hop history. Joe Tex brought wit and storytelling to soul, proved that you could make people think while making them dance, carved out a unique space in a crowded field. They could have been allies, could have supported each other in an industry that was often hostile to black artists, could have used their combined influence to create opportunities for the next generation. Instead, they wasted years on a feud that enriched nobody and left a trail of trauma in its wake. The 7 people who were shot in that Georgia nightclub all survived their physical injuries, but the psychological scars lasted much longer. The club owner sold his business within a year and left the music industry entirely, saying he couldn't stand the sound of loud noises anymore. One of the patrons who was hit developed severe anxiety and had to be medicated for years. They'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the crossfire of someone else's pride and rage, and their lives were permanently altered because 2 men couldn't find a way to coexist. When you add up the cost of the Brown and Tex feud, you have to include them in the calculation, these invisible victims whose names didn't make it into the music history books but whose pain was no less real. There's a tendency, when we talk about legendary artists, to separate their personal failures from their professional achievements, to say that the music stands apart from the man who made it. But the truth is more complicated than that clean division suggests. James Brown's relentless drive, his refusal to accept second place, his willingness to do whatever it took to win, these were the same qualities that made him great and made him dangerous. The intensity that created Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and revolutionized American music was the same intensity that put 7 people in the hospital and traumatized them for life. You can't have one without the other, can't cherry-pick the parts of his personality that produced genius while ignoring the parts that produced violence. This doesn't mean we should cancel James Brown or pretend his music doesn't matter. His contributions to soul and funk are undeniable, and millions of people have found joy and meaning in songs he created. But it does mean we should be honest about who he was, about the full complexity of his character, about the fact that he was capable of both transcendent artistry and brutal cruelty. The same is true for Joe Tex, who by most accounts could be vindictive and petty himself, who enjoyed humiliating Brown in his performances and wasn't above using dirty tactics in their ongoing war. Neither man was a simple hero or villain. They were human beings with extraordinary gifts and serious flaws, and understanding their story requires holding both truths at the same time. The music they created survives them both, of course. You can still hear James Brown's influence in every funk groove and hip-hop beat, still feel that emphasis on the one that he pioneered and turned into a revolution. You can still hear Joe Tex's humor and storytelling in artists who blend entertainment with social commentary, who understand that making people laugh doesn't mean you're not serious.